The silence that fell over the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas on that sweltering Sunday morning in June of 1882 was the kind of silence that people would talk about for the rest of their lives. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums and made a person aware of their own heartbeat, their own breath, their own guilt. Every single soul in that whitewashed building, every rancher, every shopkeeper, every self-appointed pillar of the community had turned to stare. And in the center of it all stood Eva Wainwright, alone, trembling, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of a pew, facing down the full weight of a congregation that had already decided she was guilty before she had opened her mouth. "You will leave this church," Reverend Caldwell said, his voice carrying the practiced thunder of a man who believed God spoke directly through him and through no one else. "You have brought shame upon this community, and we will not permit a thief to take communion alongside decent people." The word landed like a branding iron. Thief. Eva's jaw tightened. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned beneath a modest hat, and green eyes that had seen enough betrayal in her short life to recognize it in all its forms. She had come to this town 4 months ago with nothing but a small trunk and a determination to start over, and now they were taking even that from her. The congregation stared. Not one of them moved to her defense. Not one of them stood. Not the widow Hargrove, who had eaten Eva's cooking twice and praised it lavishly. Not the schoolteacher, Mr. Finch, who had borrowed Eva's lamp oil just last week. Not a single soul, until the door at the back of the church opened. Marshal Elias Hunter had not planned to attend Sunday service. He had spent Saturday night dealing with a cattle dispute that had nearly turned into a shooting, and he had slept perhaps 3 hours before the sound of raised voices from the direction of the church had pulled him from his cot with a marshal's instinct that trouble was trouble wherever it happened. He had arrived at the door still adjusting his badge, his dark coat thrown over his shoulders, his jaw set with the particular look of a man who calculated situations the way other men calculated card hands. He walked straight up the center aisle. "Reverend," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had talked down drunken cowboys and talked up frightened witnesses. "You want to tell me exactly what evidence you have that this woman stole anything?" The congregation stared, and kept staring, because Marshal Elias Hunter had just put himself squarely, publicly, undeniably between Eva Wainwright and every person in that room who wanted to destroy her, and not a single person there had expected it. This is the story of how they arrived at that moment, and of everything that came after. 4 months earlier, in February of 1882, Eva Wainwright had stepped off the eastbound stage from Wichita into the mud and noise of Caldwell, Kansas, with a leather trunk that was held together with a length of rope she had tied herself, and a carpetbag that contained everything she owned of any value: a photograph of her mother, a small Bible, 3 dresses, and $32 she had saved over 2 years of work as a seamstress. She was not a mail-order bride. She had not come west for a husband. She had come because her employer in Wichita had died and left his business to a nephew who had immediately made clear that Eva's continued employment would come with conditions she was not willing to accept. So she had taken her savings, booked a stage, and chosen a town the way a person chooses a seat on a crowded train, by finding one that was available. Caldwell was a cattle town, a railhead, the last town on the Kishom Trail before the Texas border. It was loud and raw and perpetually covered in a fine layer of dust that the wind lifted off the surrounding prairie and drove through every crack and seam in every building. It was also a town with a sign at the edge of it that said in painted letters, "Welcome to Caldwell. Population 1,247, law-abiding citizens only." Eva had not known whether to laugh or feel reassured by that sign. She had settled on cautiously reassured. She found work quickly. A woman named Helen Pratt ran the only boarding house in town and needed a kitchen helper who could cook. Eva could cook extremely well. Her mother had taught her from the time she was old enough to stand on a stool and stir a pot. And so, within 2 days of arriving, she had a room, meals, and a small wage. The room was small and the walls were thin, and she could hear the snoring of the cattle drovers in the rooms on either side of her. But it was hers, and it was safe, and she was grateful for it. She met the people of Caldwell slowly, the way you meet a town, one encounter at a time. She met the widow Hargrove at the general store on her second day, when they both reached for the same bolt of blue calico at the same moment, and then both apologized at the same moment, and then laughed at the coincidence of it. The widow was in her 60s, broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, with the manner of a woman who had survived things she never spoke about and had come out the other side with a brisk pragmatism about nearly everything. She invited Eva for tea that afternoon, and Eva accepted, grateful for ordinary human kindness in an unfamiliar place. She met Reverend Caldwell, a different Caldwell from the town's founder, though he enjoyed the shared name enormously, on Sunday of her first week, when she attended the First Baptist Church because it seemed like the thing to do, and because she genuinely believed in the quiet, private faith she had carried since childhood. The Reverend was in his 50s, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular combination of religious authority and social status that made him, in effect, the town's second most powerful man. He welcomed Eva warmly at the door and told her that new arrivals were a gift from God and that Caldwell was always glad to receive God's gifts. She did not meet Marshal Elias Hunter for 3 weeks, which was unusual given the size of the town, but he was a man whose work kept him either in motion or in his small office beside the jail, and their paths simply did not cross until a Tuesday morning when Eva was carrying a basket of Helen Pratt's laundry to the wash line behind the boarding house and walked directly into Elias Hunter coming around the corner from the alley. The collision was minor. The laundry basket lurched. Eva caught it. Marshal Hunter caught her elbow to steady her and then released it immediately. "Beg your pardon," he said. "It was my fault," Eva said. "I was not watching where I was going." She looked at him. He was perhaps 30, she thought, though it was hard to say. The western sun had a way of aging a face that made some men look older than they were. He was tall, with dark hair and dark eyes, and the look of a man who spent a great deal of time outdoors and very little time concerning himself with how the outdoors affected his appearance. He wore his badge the way some men wore their names, like it was simply part of him, not something he had attached. "You're Mrs. Pratt's new kitchen girl," he said. "I am." "Eva Wainwright." Elias Hunter, a pause. "You settling in all right?" "I am, thank you." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and stepped around her to continue down the alley. Eva watched him go for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she continued to the wash line and told herself it was simply because he was a notable figure in the town, and she was still learning who was who. She told herself that for several more weeks. The trouble began in March, 6 weeks after Eva arrived. It began, as trouble in small towns often does, with a misunderstanding that became a story that became a version of events that had very little connection to what had actually happened. Clarence Whitmore owned the general store. He was 45, red-faced, with the manner of a man who had done moderately well in life, and had interpreted this moderate success as proof that his judgment was superior to that of everyone around him. His wife, Dora, was small and nervous, and laughed too quickly at things that were not funny, in the way of a woman who had learned that laughter was a form of armor. The Whitmores had a daughter named Agatha, who was 17 and therefore not relevant to any romantic aspect of this story, but who was very relevant to the trouble. Agatha Whitmore had a silver hair comb. It was not a particularly expensive hair comb. It was the kind of thing a merchant's daughter might have, pretty but not precious, but it had belonged to her grandmother, and she valued it enormously. She wore it to church every Sunday without fail. In the second week of March, Agatha's silver hair comb went missing. It had been in her room on Saturday evening and was gone by Sunday morning, and Agatha was in tears and Clarence Whitmore was furious. And the story that Dora Whitmore put out, gently and with great apparent reluctance, was that the only person who had been in their home the previous day was Eva Wainwright, who had delivered a dress that Helen Pratt had altered for Dora. This was true. Eva had delivered the dress. She had been in the house for perhaps 10 minutes in the sitting room, and then she had left. She had not been upstairs near Agatha's room at any point. She had certainly not taken a hair comb, but Dora Whitmore had said the name. And once a name is said in a small town, the name takes on a life of its own. Eva first became aware of the whispers in the 3rd week of March. She noticed that conversation stopped when she entered the general store. She noticed that the widow Hargrove looked at her differently, not unkindly, but with a new caution, the way you look at someone when you are not sure what to believe about them. She noticed that 2 women at church moved their children slightly closer when Eva sat down in the same pew. She tried to address it directly. She went to Clarence Whitmore's store on a Thursday afternoon and asked to speak with him privately, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has already made up his mind and finds the subject's attempt to defend herself mildly offensive. "I never went upstairs in your house," Eva said. "I was in the sitting room for 10 minutes and I left. Whatever happened to Agatha's comb, I had nothing to do with it." "I am sure you believe that," Whitmore said, which was not the same thing as believing her. She tried Helen Pratt, who listened carefully and said she believed Eva, but that there was nothing she could do. She was a widow woman who ran a boarding house, and she had very little standing in this town to speak to matters of community reputation. She tried the widow Hargrove, who patted her hand and said that these things sometimes blew over on their own, and that Eva should simply keep her head down and be patient. She tried not to cry, which she mostly managed. What she did not try was the marshal's office, because she did not see how a matter of community gossip was something a law officer could address, and because something about Elias Hunter made her want to handle her own difficulties. It was not pride exactly, or not only pride. It was something more complicated than that, something to do with the way he had looked at her in that first brief encounter, directly and without embellishment, as if she were simply a person, and the fact of her being a woman required no special adjustment in how he addressed her. She did not want to stand in front of those eyes as a woman with a problem she could not solve. But the weeks passed and it did not blow over. It grew instead, the way a crack in plaster grows, slowly at first, then faster. By April, it was not just the hair comb. It was an unspecified sum of money that Dora Whitmore claimed had gone missing from a drawer in the same visit. It was a small brooch belonging to another woman who had had Eva over for supper and had afterward discovered the brooch missing, though whether it was truly missing or simply misplaced was never clearly established. It was the accumulation of suspicion around a woman who had come from nowhere and had no family in town and no deep roots and therefore no defenders. Elias Hunter was not an oblivious man. He was, in fact, almost constitutionally incapable of ignoring the things that happened in his town, not because he was nosy, but because he was attentive in the quiet, thorough way of a man who had been a marshal for 6 years, and had learned that the things that appeared small were often not small at all. He heard the whispers about Eva Wainwright. He noted them. He filed them in the part of his mind where he kept things that did not add up. He had occasion to observe Eva in those early spring weeks, not in any way that she would have recognized as observation, but in the way that a marshal observes the people in his town, noticing how a person carries themselves, what they pay attention to, whether they meet your eyes or avoid them. What he noticed about Eva Wainwright was that she worked hard, that she was careful with other people's things, that she gave her full attention to whoever was speaking to her, and that she had the quality of someone who was privately quite frightened but who had decided to refuse to be frightened. He found that quality interesting. He found, if he was honest with himself, quite a few things about Eva Wainwright interesting, and he was not entirely comfortable with that finding. He had not been romantically involved with anyone in 4 years. His previous engagement, to a woman in Dodge City, where he had been a deputy before coming to Caldwell, had ended badly. The woman, whose name was Clara, had ultimately chosen a merchant who could offer her a house and regular hours, and the social standing that came with being a merchant's wife, over a lawman who slept light and wore his gun everywhere and could not always account for his time. He could not blame her. He understood the calculation. He had simply not found anyone since then who made him want to revisit the possibility. He did not name what he felt about Eva Wainwright. He noted it and continued to do his job. The thing that finally made him act was something small, as the catalysts for large changes often are. It was the third week of April, and he was walking past the general store when he heard Clarence Whitmore inside, speaking to a customer in the carrying voice of a man who does not particularly care whether he is overheard, saying that he had begun to wonder whether Mrs. Pratt was wise to have taken in a young woman who seemed to have a light-fingered approach to other people's property. Elias stopped walking. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Then he walked into the store. "Whitmore," he said, "I need to speak with you." He spent 40 minutes in that conversation. He asked Whitmore, methodically and without heat, exactly what had been taken and when and by whom and what evidence he had beyond the temporal coincidence of Eva's visit and the disappearance of the comb. The answer to that last question, arrived at by patient and specific questioning, was none. Whitmore had no evidence beyond the coincidence. He had not seen Eva take anything. He had not found anything in her possession. He had no witness. He had a timeline in which Eva had been present at the house, and an object that had subsequently gone missing, and he had filled the gap between those two facts with a conclusion that served the narrative he had already decided to believe. "I will remind you," Elias said at the end of the 40 minutes, still without heat, "that in this town, accusations require evidence. And I will remind you that spreading accusations without evidence is the kind of thing that can become a legal matter." Whitmore was red-faced and indignant, but he was not stupid enough to push a marshal. Elias left the store. He stood on the boardwalk again for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward Helen Pratt's boarding house, because there was something he wanted to do that he had been putting off for reasons that were not entirely professional. Eva was in the kitchen when he knocked at the back door, which was the door the working people of the house used. Helen Pratt answered, looked at the marshal, and had the good sense to find something to do in the front of the building. "Miss Wainwright," Elias said from the doorway, "I wanted to let you know that I have spoken with Clarence Whitmore. I have made it clear to him that accusations without evidence are not something this town's legal framework supports." Eva looked at him from across the kitchen. She had flour on her hands from the bread she had been making. There was a moment where she was very clearly deciding how to respond to this, whether to accept the help gratefully or whether to treat it as an intrusion on a problem she had been trying to handle herself. "Did he listen?" she asked. "Men like Whitmore listen when it costs them something not to," Elias said. "I think he heard me." "Thank you," she said, and then, after a pause, "Why?" It was a direct question. He appreciated directness, and he answered it directly. "Because you didn't take anything," he said, "and because this town should not work the way it's been working on this." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened like a window that had been pressed shut by weather and was now being allowed to move in the natural way of things. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I am making bread and there is yesterday's stew still hot." "I have not eaten," he said. "Then sit down," she said. He sat down at Helen Pratt's kitchen table, and Eva brought him stew and bread, and they talked for an hour about everything and nothing about Caldwell, about the spring cattle drives that were beginning, about where they had each come from. He was from Missouri, originally. He had been a farmer's son who had gone west at 18 because he had looked at a farm and understood that he was not a farmer. He had been a deputy in Dodge City and then had come to Caldwell when the position of marshal opened, 4 years ago now. He told her this plainly, without embellishment, the way he did everything. She told him she was from Ohio, that her mother had been a widow who had taken in sewing to keep them, and that Eva had learned to sew and cook alongside her, and that her mother had died 3 years ago of a fever that had come on fast and departed nothing but grief. That she had worked as a seamstress in Wichita and had come here because she had needed to go somewhere. She did not tell him about the nephew in Wichita, the one with the conditions. She was not ready for that yet, but she told him enough, and he told her enough, and when he got up to go, he put on his hat and stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "I would like to call on you again, Miss Wainwright. Not in an official capacity." The directness of it caught her off guard, and she felt something warm and confusing move through her chest. "I would not object to that," she said. He nodded, touched his hat brim, and left. He called on her the following Thursday, and then the Thursday after that, and then it became a thing that was known in the town, or at least known among the people who paid attention to such things, that Marshal Hunter was spending his Thursday evenings at Helen Pratt's boarding house, sitting in the kitchen or on the back porch when the weather permitted, talking with Eva Wainwright. Helen Pratt, who was not an unobservant woman, provided tea and made herself scarce with an efficiency that made Eva suspect she had been hoping for something like this. What they talked about ranged widely. He had opinions about the cattle trade and the railroads, and the way the frontier was changing, becoming less wild and more settled, and he was not entirely sure how he felt about that change. She had opinions about books. She was an avid reader, and had already been to the town's small lending library twice, and about cooking and about the social mechanics of small towns, which she had observed from the outside long enough to have a clear-eyed view of how they worked. He found her observations precise and occasionally funny, and the funny ones surprised him because she presented them with a completely straight face. She found herself looking forward to Thursday with a sharpness that she recognized as significant. She found herself noticing things during the week that she wanted to tell him. She found herself, on a Thursday morning, choosing which dress to wear with more care than the occasion strictly required, and then being annoyed at herself for doing so. She was 26 years old. She had not been naive enough to believe she was completely immune to the possibility of romantic feeling, but she had been privately resigned to the idea that the circumstances of her life, working, moving, managing, did not leave a great deal of room for the kind of feeling that asked you to let someone else in. She had been keeping people at arm's length for long enough that the muscles involved in that were strong and habitual. Elias Hunter was doing something to those muscles. He was not doing it dramatically or with any apparent intention of doing it. He was simply sitting across a kitchen table and being exactly himself, honest, direct, steady, with an occasional quiet humor that appeared so rarely and disappeared so quickly that you were never entirely sure you had seen it. And the effect of that, accumulated Thursday by Thursday, was that Eva's habit of distance was being quietly undone. May arrived. The cattle drives brought their temporary population of drovers and wranglers and the noise and dust they carried with them, and Elias had less time. He still came on Thursdays when he could, and twice they took a walk along the edge of town in the long spring evening, not touching, speaking of ordinary things, the sunset enormous and orange over the flat Kansas horizon. On the second of those walks, their hands brushed once as they turned to come back, and neither of them mentioned it, but both of them felt it, and the silence after the brush was the kind of silence that is fuller than speech. The hair comb appeared at the end of May. It turned up in Agatha Whitmore's own room, in the pocket of a coat she had not worn since February, the coat in which she had been wearing the comb on the Saturday before it went missing. She had, apparently, put it in her pocket while adjusting it and then forgotten. The coat had been at the back of the wardrobe. When she went to bring out summer clothes, she found it. Agatha told her mother. Dora Whitmore told no one at first. Clarence Whitmore, when informed, said that the comb had obviously been there all along, and that this had no bearing on anything, which was the position of a man who would rather quietly bury evidence of his own error than correct the public record. But Agatha was 17, and she had a conscience that had not yet been fully calcified by social convenience. She told her friend Nettie. Nettie told her mother. And the information reached Elias Hunter on a Wednesday morning at the beginning of June, second-hand and somewhat garbled but clear in its essentials. He went to the Whitmore store directly and had a conversation with Clarence Whitmore that lasted less than 20 minutes and was considerably less patient than the previous one. "The comb was in your daughter's coat pocket the entire time," he said. "Miss Wainwright was accused, however indirectly, of theft on the basis of no evidence. That evidence has now been conclusively resolved. You will make that known." "People did not accuse her directly," Whitmore began. "You said to Edward Ferguson at the feed store that you would not have a woman of uncertain character delivering goods from your establishment," Elias said. "I know that because Ferguson told me. That is direct enough." Whitmore was silent. "Make it known," Elias said, and left. He went directly from the store to Helen Pratt's and told Eva what had been found. She was standing at the kitchen counter and she listened with her hands still, which was how she listened when something was important. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I always knew I had not taken it, but knowing it and having it known are different things." "They are," he agreed. Does it undo it?" she asked. The things that were said, he wanted to say yes. He was honest enough not to. "Not completely," he said. "But it changes the foundation. People who already wanted to believe well of you will believe it more firmly. People who were undecided will reconsider. The ones who wanted to believe the worst," he paused. "They will adjust their story, but they will not entirely let go of it." "That is what I expected," she said. There was a silence. Then she looked at him and something in her face was open in a way it had not been before. "Elias," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "I need to tell you something that I have not told anyone here, about why I came to Caldwell." She told him about the employer in Wichita, about the nephew who had inherited the business, about the conditions. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she told most things, but her hands were not entirely still, and her eyes were very careful on his face, watching for his reaction. His reaction was what she had hoped for and had not allowed herself to entirely count on. His face did not change its expression exactly, but something in his eyes went very dark and still with a feeling that was not anger at her but anger on her behalf, which is one of the most specific and recognizable feelings a person can see on another person's face if they know what to look for. "You should not have had to leave," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I did not see another choice that I was willing to make." "You chose right," he said. She breathed out slowly. "I wanted you to know," she said, "because I think you should know who I am, not just the version that exists in this town, but who I actually am." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I have been coming to know who you actually are for some time." She looked at him. "I think you have as well," she said. "Elias." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, and the warmth of it went through her like sunlight through water. He removed his hand before it became something that required naming, but it had been what it was. They both knew it. He did not declare himself. Not yet. He was careful by nature, not cold careful, the way a man is careful when he has been hurt before and has taken stock of what he is doing this time. And she was careful too, for her own reasons. But the Thursday evenings continued, and the warmth between them built steadily. And when he handed her down from the porch step one evening after a brief rain had made the ground slick, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary and she let him. And when she looked at his face, there was something there that made her breath come differently than usual. What she did not know, what came to her later in pieces, was that there were people in Caldwell who had not forgotten, who had filed away the story of Eva Wainwright and the missing comb, and were not pleased that the comb's reappearance had diffused it, because the story had served a function beyond the specific accusation. The story had served the function of keeping Eva at a certain social distance, of marking her as someone whose standing was uncertain, whose character was unproven, who could not presume to belonging. The particular person who had not forgotten, who had in fact never had any intention of letting go, was Dora Whitmore. Dora Whitmore was not a cruel woman in the way of people who enjoy cruelty. She was a frightened woman, which is sometimes more dangerous, because frightened people act in defense of things that are not threatened and cannot be reassured by any rational argument because fear is not rational. What Dora was frightened of was status. She had spent 20 years as Clarence Whitmore's wife building a position in this town, brick by careful brick, and she understood with the animal accuracy of a woman who has never had very much that her position depended on a certain social architecture that had to be maintained. Eva Wainwright had come in, and without meaning to, or perhaps even noticing, had begun to threaten that architecture. She was younger and sharper and more capable than Dora in ways that Dora felt viscerally. Reverend Caldwell liked Eva, which meant points of social capital that Dora had held were shifting. And Marshal Hunter, whom Dora had always considered a potential ally in the general project of maintaining civic order as she understood it, was sitting in that woman's kitchen every Thursday evening like a man with intentions. So Dora prepared a second story. She prepared it carefully, over weeks, in the small tactical increments of a woman who had learned to fight with social weapons because she had no others. She mentioned, in various conversations, in the way of someone offering a concern rather than making an accusation, that she had noticed certain discrepancies in the boarding house accounts, numbers that did not add up in the ledger that Helen Pratt kept, discrepancies that coincided with Eva's arrival. She mentioned that she had heard, from a reliable though unnamed source, that Eva had left Wichita under circumstances that were not entirely clear. She mentioned that young women who arrived alone without family were sometimes not what they presented themselves as. None of it was a direct accusation. All of it was a trap. It was a trap with a spring mechanism, and the mechanism was the combination of social pressure and community trust, and it was set to go off on a Sunday morning in June at the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, in front of everyone. The particular Sunday was the second week of June. Eva had not known anything specific was coming. She had sensed an increase in the strange social weather conversations that stopped a half-beat too late to be natural, glances between women at the quilting circle that she was not part of but could observe from the doorway when she delivered Helen Pratt's contribution. She had thought it was the residue of the comb business, still settling. She had not known it was a new storm. She arrived at church in her good dress, which was a deep blue with her hair pinned under her hat. She sat in her usual pew, midway back on the left side. The service began normally, the opening hymn, the scripture reading, the collection plate that she added her small coin to. She was noticing nothing particular when Reverend Caldwell, at the end of the service, before the final blessing, said that he wished to address a matter of community concern. The community concern was Eva Wainwright, though he did not use her name immediately. He spoke first in generalities about trust, about the sacred nature of a congregation, about the responsibility that each member of the body of believers had toward the whole. And then he said that it had come to his attention, from multiple sources whose veracity he had no reason to doubt, that there was a member of the congregation whose character had proven to be less than what the congregation deserved. He looked at Eva. Every head in the church turned. The weight of it, the physical, collective weight of all those faces, landed on her like a net. She felt her stomach drop and her hands close on the edge of the pew, and she made herself stay very still. "There are questions," Reverend Caldwell said, "about property, about accounts, about the circumstances of this person's arrival among us, questions that have not been satisfactorily answered, and as the shepherd of this congregation, I cannot in good conscience allow these questions to remain unaddressed." He named her then. Eva Wainwright, said that she would need to leave the church while the congregation discussed the matter and that she would not be welcome to take communion until the matter was resolved. The word thief hung in the air without being said. It did not need to be said. The architecture of the moment said it. Eva stood up. She stood up because she could not sit in that pew with that word in the air above her. She gripped the back of the pew in front of her and she looked at Reverend Caldwell and she said, clearly and without a tremor in her voice though there was one in her chest, "What specific evidence do you have against me?" No one moved to help her. Not the widow Hargrove. Not Mr. Finch. Not a single soul in that congregation who had eaten food she had helped prepare or borrowed things from her, or passed the time of day with her at the post office. The silence was total, and it was the silence of people who had already made their choice and were waiting for her to accept the consequences. And then the door at the back of the church opened. Elias Hunter came up the center aisle in the particular way of a man who has assessed a situation and made a decision, and is no longer open to reconsideration. He came to the front of the church and he stood beside Eva, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her, and he looked at Reverend Caldwell with an expression that was very calm and very clear and offered no retreat. "Reverend," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what evidence you have that this woman stole anything." The silence that followed that question was something the people in that church would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Because what Marshal Hunter had done, what everyone in that building understood he had done, was put his name, his badge, his standing, his public authority on the line for Eva Wainwright. He had not simply defended her privately in a conversation that could be dismissed. He had done it here in this room in front of the congregation, with his badge on his chest and his voice carrying to every corner. The whole congregation stared. Reverend Caldwell recovered first, because he was a man who did not easily lose his footing. He said that the matter was one of community standards, not strictly legal ones, and that the marshal's jurisdiction— "My jurisdiction," Elias said, "extends to the protection of people in this town from false accusation, which is a legal harm whether it occurs in a church or outside one. I know about the hair comb, Reverend. I know it was found in the Whitmore girl's coat pocket where her own hands had placed it. I know that the so-called account discrepancies Miss Wainwright is being accused of have not been documented or verified by anyone with actual knowledge of the boarding house accounts. And I know that this accusation has been built over weeks by people who have a personal grievance against Miss Wainwright that has nothing to do with theft and everything to do with the fact that she does not have family in this town to defend her reputation, and they thought she could be pressured without consequence." His voice had not risen. It was still calm, but in the quiet of that church, it was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. "I am asking you," he said to Reverend Caldwell, "in front of this congregation to state clearly whether you have specific, documented, verifiable evidence that Eva Wainwright has stolen anything from anyone. Yes or no?" Reverend Caldwell's silver head moved. His jaw worked. The people in the pews were utterly still. "No," he said at last. "Not documented specifically, then this accusation should not have been made from a pulpit," Elias said, "and I believe the congregation deserves to hear that." He turned then and looked at the pews, not accusingly, just looking the way he looked at everything directly, taking note. "This woman has worked in this town for 4 months," he said to the congregation. "She has not stolen anything. She has been the subject of speculation based on a missing hair comb that turned up in the rightful owner's own coat pocket. The account discrepancies that were alluded to are not documented anywhere and originate with a source who has demonstrated a pattern of making accusations without evidence. I believe most of you know the right thing here, even if you have not yet done it." He stopped speaking. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. It had a different texture, a different quality. It was the silence of people rearranging their understanding. Eva was standing very straight and very still beside him. She had not moved since he arrived. She was not going to allow herself to cry in this building in front of these people, and the effort of that was enormous, but she managed it. The widow Hargrove stood up. She stood up from her pew, broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, her face set with the expression of a woman who had come to a decision, and she said in her brisk, carrying voice, "I know Eva Wainwright's character. I have had her in my home and at my table, and I know who she is. I am ashamed that I let doubt creep in when it had no business being there, and I am saying so publicly. It was the widow Hargrove who broke the dam. After her, others shifted. Not all of them. Some sat with their faces closed and their judgments already set, but enough. The schoolteacher Finch said something brief and pointed about evidence-based conclusions. Two women from the quilting circle exchanged glances, and then one of them stood and said that she had always found Eva to be honest and hardworking, and she was sorry the matter had come to this. Reverend Caldwell said that the morning's proceedings had clearly been premature and that the matter would be tabled, which was the closest thing to a retraction he was capable of making. It was not enough, but it was what it was. Elias touched Eva's elbow lightly and steered her toward the door. They went out into the June sun together, and the door closed behind them, and Eva stood on the church steps and breathed in the hot, dusty air of the Kansas morning, and did not immediately speak. He stood beside her. He did not crowd her. He gave her the space she needed. After a while she said, "You knew it might cost you something." "It might," he agreed. "A marshal who publicly challenges a reverend in front of the congregation. A marshal who asked a reverend for evidence," he said. "That is all I asked. I believe in evidence." She turned to look at him. The sun was on his face and he was squinting slightly against it, and there was a line of tension at the corner of his jaw that told her this had cost him something even if he was not going to call it a cost. "Elias," she said. "Eva," he said. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "I need to sit down somewhere that is not this churchyard." "My office has a chair," he said, "and coffee." "That sounds like heaven," she said, and her voice broke very slightly on the last word, which was the nearest she would permit herself to falling apart. They walked to the marshal's office, which was a small, spare building with a desk and 2 chairs and a stove and a cell in the back that was currently empty. He made coffee. She sat in one of the chairs and held the cup in both hands and let the shaking in her hands gradually still. "Tell me about the account discrepancies," he said, not because he believed them but because he needed to know what had been alleged so he could address it specifically. She told him. She told him that Helen Pratt's accounts were Helen's accounts, and she had no access to them and no role in keeping them. He nodded. He asked if there were any records that showed her hands or eyes had never touched those books. She said Helen Pratt had always kept the books herself and could confirm it. He said he would speak with Helen Pratt. He did that afternoon. Helen Pratt confirmed every word and added with some heat that she had been about to come to the church herself when the marshal had already gone in, and that she was furious the matter had been allowed to reach a Sunday service, and that she had a few things she intended to say to Dora Whitmore that were not appropriate for a lady to say, but that she intended to say them anyway. Elias let Helen Pratt manage that particular conversation. He had reason to believe it would be handled effectively. The afternoon of that Sunday was quiet. The extraordinary nature of the morning seemed to have settled over the town like the strange stillness after a storm, where people are still checking the sky and touching the things that did not blow away. Eva went back to the boarding house and changed out of her good dress and sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself, in private, 10 minutes of actual crying, not the dramatic kind but the quiet, controlled kind, more release than grief. And when it was done, she washed her face and braided her hair and went to help Helen with the evening meal. Elias came by in the early evening. Not his usual Thursday, it was a Sunday, but he came to the back door and knocked, and when Eva opened it he stood there with his hat in his hands. "I wanted to check that you were all right," he said. "I am all right," she said. "Will you come in?" He came in. Helen had conveniently found errands. They sat at the kitchen table and he drank the coffee she poured and she drank hers, and outside the window the long summer evening was turning gold and then lavender. "You could have stayed out of it," she said. "This morning, you could have let it unfold and dealt with the legal questions afterward if any arose." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at her. "Because I have been coming to sit at this table for months," he said, "and I am not a man who is able to pretend that it is a casual or indifferent practice. I come here because I want to. Because you are the most interesting person in this town, And because I find that I think about you when I am not here, and I look forward to Thursday the way I have not looked forward to anything in a long time. And I was not able to stand in the back of that church and let them do that to you. I was not capable of it." She looked at him steadily. "I have been falling in love with you," he said. "I did not plan to. I am not sure what I intend to do about it. But it is the truth, and you should have it." The words sat in the kitchen air between them, solid and warm. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the reverse of what he had done weeks ago, and she said, "I have been falling in love with you too, Elias. Since February, I think. Since the basket of laundry in the alley." He looked at her. Then the rare, careful thing happened. He smiled, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less contained and entirely himself. "The laundry basket," he said. "It was a memorable encounter," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, and they sat like that in Helen Pratt's kitchen with the summer evening going dark outside the window, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already said. He was 30 years old. She was 26. Both of them had arrived at this moment through paths that had not been simple, and both of them understood that. They were not young people in the first flush of uncomplicated feeling. They were people who had learned caution and who were choosing, despite caution, to be here. That made it more rather than less. The weeks that followed that Sunday were a transformation of the town's social weather, slow but real. Dora Whitmore was very quiet. Clarence Whitmore was very quiet. They had not been publicly disgraced. Elias had not named them specifically in the church, though anyone with any intelligence understood the source. But they were aware that they had overreached and that the ground had not held. Dora Whitmore began attending quilting circle meetings again, but said very little, which was a change everyone in the circle noted without remarking on. Reverend Caldwell preached a sermon the following Sunday on the sin of false witness, which he did not frame as an apology, but which everyone understood was the nearest he was capable of getting to one. Eva attended, sitting with the widow Hargrove, who had installed herself beside Eva with the air of a woman who had recalibrated her loyalties and was not going to be moved again. The widow's presence was a kind of social endorsement that mattered in the practical way of small-town mechanics, and Eva was grateful for it, though she said so privately rather than publicly. The Marshal and Eva's Thursday evenings continued, but the nature of them had changed. They no longer pretended to be something casual and undefined. Elias called on her with the explicit purpose of calling on her, and Helen Pratt set out the tea things with the suppressed satisfaction of a woman whose plot had worked out the way she had hoped. The widow Hargrove stopped by one Thursday with what she described as a small cake for Helen's pantry, but which was really a pretext for meeting Elias formally in the context of courtship, which she did with great efficiency and afterward told Eva that he seemed like a serious man who meant what he said, which was her highest form of recommendation. He asked her to take supper with him at the hotel in July, which was a public statement because eating at the hotel together was the kind of thing that said something in a town like Caldwell. She wore the deep blue dress. He wore his good coat. They ate in the hotel dining room and spoke about all the things they now had 4 months of Thursday evenings to speak about. And when he walked her back to the boarding house in the warm July night and stopped at the door and looked at her, he said, "I would like to ask you something that I do not want to ask standing on a doorstep." "Then ask me inside," she said. Helen Pratt was in the sitting room. She looked at both of them with large, innocent eyes, and then said she had letters to write in her room. They sat in the sitting room, which was different from the kitchen, more formal, with its horsehair settee and the small framed prints on the walls. He sat across from her, and was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing his words because the words mattered. "I have not been in a hurry to get here," he said, "to this conversation. Because I wanted to be sure, not of you. I have been sure of you for some time, but of myself, of whether I am offering you something real, whether I have the capacity to be what you would need." She said nothing because she understood that he needed to get through this in his own way. "I think I do," he said. "I think I have been the kind of man who keeps himself at a distance because it was safer, and I think that was the choice of a man who had been hurt and was protecting the wound. And I do not want to make that choice anymore. I want," he stopped, started again. "I want to ask you to marry me, Eva. Not because you need a husband, and not because a marshal should have a wife, and not because this town will understand the situation better with a formal arrangement. Because I want to spend my life with you. Because I find you to be the most honest, the most capable, the person I most want to be in a room with for the rest of my time, if you will have me." She was looking at him. Her eyes were bright. "You are the only person," she said, "who has ever stood beside me instead of behind me or in front of me or at a careful, concerned distance. Every time there was a choice, you chose me, not the easier thing, me." A pause. "Yes, Elias, I will marry you." He released a breath that he had apparently been holding since before he began speaking, and she laughed softly at the sight of it. And he heard the laugh, and his face did that thing again, opened, transformed, years younger. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the horsehair settee and took her hands in both of his and looked at her face for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they have been waiting to look at properly. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They told Helen Pratt first that same evening, and Helen clasped her hands together and said, "I knew it," with such fierce satisfaction that both Elias and Eva laughed. They told the widow Hargrove the next morning, and the widow shook Elias' hand in the manner of a woman concluding a transaction, and then hugged Eva fiercely and murmured something in her ear that made Eva's eyes go briefly wet and happy. The news moved through Caldwell in the way that good news in a small town moves, differently from bad news, quicker, and with a different texture. Most people received it warmly. The cattle trade had given Caldwell a complicated relationship with law enforcement, but Elias Hunter was widely respected, and the people who had watched the Sunday church affair had quietly come to the conclusion that his conduct had been correct, and that Eva Wainwright was a different kind of person than the story that had been built around her. The widow Hargrove told anyone who would listen that she had always known it, conveniently eliding the weeks of cautious withdrawal, and was not corrected. They were married on a Saturday in August in the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, which was a choice that Elias thought was either brave or strategic, and Eva thought was both. Reverend Caldwell performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity. The church was full. The widow Hargrove sat in the front row and wept at the appropriate moments and also at several inappropriate ones. Helen Pratt wore her good hat and held herself together with admirable composure until the vows were spoken, at which point she wept nearly as comprehensively as the widow. Eva wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored cotton that she had embroidered at the collar and cuffs with small flowers because she could sew beautifully, and she had wanted to make the thing herself. She had spent 2 weeks on it in the evenings after the kitchen work was done, and Helen Pratt had come to check on her progress every night with tea and barely concealed excitement. When Eva walked up the center aisle of the First Baptist Church on the arm of the widow Hargrove, who had volunteered for this role with the seriousness of a woman accepting a commission, she was composed and lovely and certain, in a way that she had not been certain of very many things in her life. Elias stood at the front of the church in his good coat with his badge on, and looked at her walking toward him, and felt something that was not purely describable, but was somewhere in the region of gratitude so large it pressed against the inside of the chest. The ceremony was simple and real. When the Reverend asked if anyone had objections, there was a charged pause that went on approximately half a beat too long before no one spoke. Afterward, Elias told Eva he thought that pause had been deliberate, and she said she would not put it past Reverend Caldwell to create a small drama even in the performing of a decent act, and Elias laughed, which startled the Reverend, who was not used to people laughing immediately after their wedding ceremony. They moved into the house that came with the marshal's position, A small, solid house 2 streets from the main road, with a kitchen that was larger than the office kitchen and a back garden that had been completely neglected. Eva looked at the back garden and immediately saw what it could be. She told Elias this, and he said he had a shovel and she was welcome to it, and she told him he was going to be doing more of the digging than he currently understood, and they were both smiling. The autumn of 1882 settled into them like something earned. Eva turned the back garden into something alive. She planted the last of the cool season vegetables before the frost came and put in bulbs for the spring, and put up fencing with Elias' help on a Saturday afternoon that ended with them, both covered in dirt and laughing at nothing in particular. She continued helping Helen Pratt in the kitchen 2 mornings a week, because Helen genuinely needed the help and because it gave her a connection to the town that she valued. She continued going to church on Sunday, which was an act of mild defiance that she did not name as such but which everyone in the congregation understood as exactly that. Her relationship with Reverend Caldwell was what it was. They were not enemies. They were not friends. They were 2 people who occupied the same community and who had been on opposite sides of something significant, and who had both, in different ways, survived it. He was not a terrible man. He was a man who had been used by a frightened woman's social architecture, and who had acted without sufficient investigation, and who had, in the aftermath, not entirely acknowledged what he had done, but had not done it again. Eva decided this was sufficient to continue attending the church and praying in the pew and letting the matter lie where it had fallen. Elias understood her position on this without needing it explained, which was one of the many things she was discovering about being married to him, the number of things that did not need explaining. He was a man who paid attention, who had spent years developing the skill of reading situations, and this skill had a domestic application that was perhaps unexpected, but was enormously useful. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He noticed when something was troubling her, and he gave her space to come to it in her own time rather than pressing. He was not a man given to grand romantic declarations. He had made the necessary one, and it had been exactly sufficient, but he was present in the small, continuous way that matters more over a lifetime. She noticed things about him too. She noticed that he slept lightly and often got up in the night for reasons he did not explain, and she understood that this was the habit of a man whose job required constant readiness, and that it was not going to change. She noticed that he found it very difficult to take a day entirely without purpose, that on the rare Sundays he had nothing official to do, he would find something, fencing that needed checking or woodwork that needed attention, and that the restlessness of those days was better handled if she suggested something specific rather than just leaving him to manage it. She noticed that he had a stack of books on the table by his side of the bed that were battered and well read, and that he reread them periodically, mostly history and natural science, with one dog-eared novel that he had obviously read a dozen times and was never going to voluntarily admit to having read at all. She borrowed the novel without asking and read it in an afternoon and put it back without comment, and a few days later mentioned, casually, a passage from it that she found particularly well written, and watched his face and found exactly what she had expected to find. "You read it," he said. "It is a good book," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You are a thoroughly aggravating woman," he said, and he was smiling. "I know," she said serenely. In November she missed her monthly cycle. She was cautious about what she told herself. It was early, it could be other things. The disruption of settling into a new life could affect such things, but by December she was no longer able to attribute it to disruption, and she went to see Doc Maynard, who confirmed what she had begun to believe. She told Elias that evening after supper, at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the stove warm against the December cold outside. She said simply, "We are going to have a child." The expression that moved through his face was one she held in her memory for a long time afterward. It was complex in the way of things that are too large for a single feeling, something compounded of joy and something that might have been fear and something that was purely, fiercely tender. He stood up from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, his face close to her hair, and said, "Eva," and that was all. Just her name, said in a way that contained everything. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. She was sick in the mornings with a thoroughness that she privately found irritating, given that she was a person who preferred to be functional. But it eased by March, and by April she was feeling well, and the garden was coming alive with the bulbs she had planted in the fall. And she thought there was something right about that timing. The green things coming up from the cold ground in the same season that her body was doing its own version of that same work. Elias worried more than she expected, and less than she feared. He did not hover, which she would have found intolerable, but he was attentive in the specific, practical ways, making sure Doc Maynard had been seen, making sure she was not lifting things that should not be lifted, coming home for midday dinner when his schedule permitted in a way he had not done before. She recognized this as his way of managing concern, and she accepted it, and occasionally she took his hand when he was standing next to her worrying without knowing he was doing it, and the touch would settle him. The baby came in July of 1883 on a brutally hot Saturday afternoon, when the air over the Kansas prairie was absolutely still, and the town of Caldwell was drowsy with heat. He was born after 14 hours of labor, which Eva endured with the same combination of stubbornness and refusal to make a larger fuss than necessary that she brought to most difficult things. Doc Maynard attended, with the widow Hargrove present in the role of practical assistant and Helen Pratt in the role of person who felt compelled to be nearby, even if she was not always useful. Elias spent the 14 hours on the other side of the house door, which was where Doc Maynard and the widow Hargrove had firmly directed him. He was not a man who paced as a rule. He paced. When Doc Maynard opened the door and said, "A healthy boy, Marshal," Elias' face did something that the doctor, who had attended a great many births and told a great many fathers this news, recognized as a singular reaction. It was not just happiness. It was something struck, something undone, something remade. They named him James for Elias' father, who had died when Elias was 12 and whom Elias had loved and not been able to speak of easily for most of the years since. Eva had suggested the name without knowing all of what it meant, and Elias had been very quiet for a moment, and then said yes, that was the right name, and she had understood from the quality of that quiet that she had found the right one. James Hunter was a large, healthy, furiously opinionated baby who made his views on hunger, cold, and the inconvenience of being put down all very clear from the beginning. Eva, who had expected to be somewhat undone by new motherhood, found instead that she took to it with a competence that surprised even her. Not because it was easy, because it was not, but because she was a person who was good at the work that mattered, and this mattered entirely. Elias was a revelation as a father. He had not known what to expect of himself, and neither had she. And what they got was a man who was awkward with the baby in the beginning with the careful awkwardness of someone who has not been near infants and is aware he might be doing it wrong. And then gradually, over weeks, became easy with him, carrying James against his shoulder with the particular competence that develops through practice, sitting with the lamp low in the middle of the night so Eva could sleep while he held the baby through the fussy hours. A thing he offered once, and then simply did without discussion. She woke one of those nights and found the lamp glowing and Elias sitting in the chair by the window with James asleep on his chest, the baby's small fist curled around Elias' collar, and the expression on Elias' face in the low light was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a person. She lay and watched them for a moment before she let herself be known to be awake, because she wanted to hold the sight of it for herself before anything changed it. The town of Caldwell, meanwhile, continued its ongoing project of being itself. The cattle trade brought seasons of noise and activity, and the occasional incident that kept Elias busy, and reminded Eva of the specific nature of being married to a lawman, which involved a sustained background awareness of the possible that she managed by not thinking about it constantly and by trusting his competence. He had a deputy now, a young man named Willis who was earnest and capable and slightly in awe of Elias, which was useful. There were incidents, a dispute over water rights that threatened to become violent and required Elias to be away for 3 days in early 1884, a robbery at the bank in May that was resolved quickly. But Caldwell in 1882 and beyond was a town in the process of becoming more settled, less wild, the rail connection having brought a different kind of commerce and a different kind of population. Dora Whitmore moved to Wichita in 1884 when Clarence's business expanded and he opened a second store there. Their departure was not marked with any particular ceremony. Eva, when she heard the news, felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph and was not resentment but was something simpler, the finality of something that no longer required any energy. She mentioned it to Elias that evening, and he said that was probably best for everyone, and she agreed, and they did not discuss it further. Reverend Caldwell remained. He remained for another decade, in fact, and his relationship with Eva evolved slowly into something that was not warmth, but was genuine respect of the kind that survives disagreement. He baptized James and 2 years later baptized their daughter, whom they named Catherine after Eva's mother, and he performed both ceremonies with the full attention of a man who takes the sacred seriously even when his personal record in related matters is imperfect. Eva accepted this imperfect version of reconciliation and decided it was enough. The widow Hargrove became, over those years, a central figure in the family's life in the way of a person who simply refuses to be anything less than that. She was at the house constantly, with opinions and soup, and the kind of direct, unsentimental affection that was exactly what it was and made no apologies for it. She adored James with the fierce, practical love of a woman who had not had grandchildren and was going to conduct herself as though she did. She was at James's second birthday celebration and at Catherine's birth, and she was the one who told Eva, during a particularly difficult night 6 weeks after Catherine's birth when Eva was exhausted and tearful and questioning everything, that this passed and that she had done harder things, and that the marshal was downstairs making terrible coffee, but the intention behind it was good, which made Eva laugh, which was the point. Elias and Eva's marriage settled into itself the way good things settle, not into stagnation, but into the comfortable sureness of two people who know each other thoroughly and have stopped needing the beginning of love alertness because they have replaced it with something deeper and more sustaining. They still talked at the kitchen table the way they always had about the town, about the children, about the books she read, and the problems he turned over. He still had the quality of presence that she had noticed from the beginning, the way he was fully in whatever room he was in, not absent or distant in the manner of men who have sealed themselves off from domestic life. She still had the quality of perception that he had noticed, the way she saw accurately and reported faithfully, and found the thing that was actually true rather than the thing that was comfortable. In 1885, James was nearly 2 and already walking with the specific determination of a child who has decided that standing still is not a reasonable option. Catherine was 3 months old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of studying a face before deciding what to make of it. Eva was 30, Elias was 34, and the house on the 2 streets from the main road had a back garden that was genuinely beautiful now, 3 years of labor having turned it into a productive, lovely space with the kind of established presence that only time creates. On an evening in October of that year, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Eva and Elias were sitting on the back porch in the cooling evening air. The garden had been put to bed for winter, the last vegetables in, the perennials cut back, the bulbs she was planting this year set into the prepared beds. The sky was enormous and clear and enormously full of stars. You remember, Eva said, the morning at the church. I remember it very well, he said. I have thought about it often, she said, about the particular courage it required to do that and about how it changed things. It changed things for me too, he said. Not in the way people might think. It was not dramatic from my side. It was simply the only thing I was willing to do. I could not stand in the back of that church and watch it happen. It was not a choice. It was what it was. She looked at him in the starlight. That is what makes it courage, she said, when the only choice that is available to you is the hard one. He was quiet for a moment. I think I was already in love with you then, he said. I had not named it yet, but it was there. And that made it, I think even if I had not been, I would have done it. But the fact that I was made it feel necessary in a different way, personal. You were fighting for me, she said. I was fighting for what was right, he said. But yes, it was you. She reached over and took his hand. The way she had done that first night in the kitchen when he had said the words and she had said them back. And they sat like that in the October night with the stars above the Kansas prairie and the children sleeping inside, and the garden put to rest for its winter and ready for its spring. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in February of 1882 with $32 and a trunk held together with rope and a determination not to be undone by whatever came next. She thought about the congregation staring and the weight of all those faces, and the silence and the particular solitude of standing alone in a crowd of people who have already decided. She thought about the door opening and a man walking up the center aisle with his badge on and his voice steady, and his position made absolutely clear. She thought about the kitchen and the table and the Thursdays. She thought about laundry baskets in alleys and flour on her hands and coffee in a marshal's office after the storm. She thought about the horsehair settee, and the words said plainly, and the cream-colored dress with the embroidered flowers. She thought about 14 hours and a door and a doctor's voice saying a healthy boy. She thought about a lamp and a chair and a baby's fist and a man's undefended face. She thought about the hidden motive behind Dora Whitmore's cruelty, which had been fear, which had been an insufficient substitute for courage, which had ultimately not served its purpose. She thought about the trap that had been laid, the forced choice that the congregation had been maneuvered toward, the dark past of small-town social mechanics that never fully changed but could be pushed back against. She thought about the fact that the secret she had carried from Wichita, from the employer's nephew, and his conditions was not a secret from Elias. Had not been for years. He had heard it and had not flinched and had not made it into a story about her weakness, but into a story about her strength, which was the only version she could live with. I am glad you came through that door, she said. I am glad you were standing there when I did, he said. The stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent way. The prairie stretched out in every direction in the dark, enormous and flat and full of the particular silence of open spaces. Inside the house, James stirred briefly in his sleep and was quiet. Catherine made a small sound and settled. Tell me something, he said. What? Something you have not told me yet. She thought about it. I want another garden, she said. A larger one, in the spring. I want to expand past the fence where the unused ground is. I will dig it for you, he said. I will help. You will supervise, he said, and she heard the smile in it. I will do both, she said firmly. He laughed, quiet and real, and the sound of it in the October dark was one of the best sounds she knew. Deal, he said. They stayed on the porch a while longer, until the night had gone cold enough that sensible people would go inside. Then they went inside and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, and Elias fell asleep with the easy speed of a man whose conscience was clear and whose work was done, and Eva lay awake for a few minutes more, not from worry but from the particular alertness of someone who is, for perhaps the first time in her life, fully at home. She thought about the congregation staring. She thought about the whole congregation staring. She thought about what it meant that a man had walked into that stare and made himself the thing that stood between her and it, not because it was required of him, or because it was strategic or because it would cost him nothing, but because it was right, and because she mattered to him, and those two things were indistinguishable. She thought about all of it, the injustice of being accused without evidence, the loneliness of standing alone, the transformation of one man's choosing the hard right thing over the easy wrong one. She thought about how that single act had been the axis on which everything had turned. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Kansas stars went on burning, as they had burned before the first cattle drive, before the first railroad, before the first town that dared to put a sign up on the edge of nowhere and call itself law-abiding, as they would burn long after all of it had become history and legend, and the particular kind of story that people in future years would barely be able to imagine, about a woman alone in a church, and a man who walked up the center aisle and stood beside her and asked, simply, for the evidence. She was asleep before she knew it, in the house that was hers, in the life she had built, beside the man who had chosen her completely, and outside the October wind moved across the prairie the way it always moved, carrying the dust and the stars and everything that had ever happened here and everything that was still to come. They expanded the garden in the spring, as she had promised. It was larger than either of them had quite planned, because Eva's vision for it had expanded over the winter months, and Elias dug and did not complain, and James, at almost 3 years old, was fascinated by worms in the turned earth, and made his opinions about the worms known with great enthusiasm, and Catherine in her blanket on the back porch watched all of it with her father's dark eyes and her mother's measuring expression. By summer, the expanded garden was producing more than the family could use, and Eva began bringing the surplus to Helen Pratt and the widow Hargrove, and one Thursday she appeared at the marshal's office with a basket of vegetables for Deputy Willis, who had a young wife and a baby of his own, and Elias watched her from the doorway of the office and felt the particular feeling that he had never fully had a name for. That was not only love, but was love looking at itself in action. Years later, when James was old enough to be told the story, not all of it at once but in pieces, the way you tell children difficult truths, built up layer by layer until the full picture is available, he would ask his mother about the church and about what it felt like when everyone was staring. Eva thought about how to answer that. It felt like falling, she said. Like the floor was gone and I was in the air and did not know whether I was going up or down. And then Papa came in, James said. And then your father came in, she said, and he stood up for you. He stood beside me, she said, because that was the accurate thing. Not in front of me, not behind me, beside me. And that made all the difference. James considered this with the seriousness of a 10-year-old who is genuinely trying to understand something. I would do that too, he said, if someone was doing that to someone and it was wrong. She looked at her son, dark-haired like his father, with her green eyes, serious and good, and already possessed of the particular combination of directness and care that she recognized from long acquaintance. I know you would, she said. She looked across the kitchen to where Elias was sitting at the table, and he was looking at her with the expression he still had sometimes, across rooms, across years, the expression of a man looking at the thing that is most essentially his life and knowing it fully for what it is. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to James and said, "Now help me with the beans." And the ordinary beautiful life continued in the house on the 2 streets from the main road in Caldwell, Kansas, where the marshal and his wife and their children and their garden and their kitchen table and their Thursdays and their stars were exactly, quietly, completely home.